So recently, when I was browsing the interwebs for new ideas and such, I came across this utensil, which is a kitchen sieve, and it's used to actually boil various vegetables, etc. And you can just immerse this directly into the water and lift it out of the water with your vegetables inside. And what's pretty interesting about this is that it actually folds out, and when I saw this I thought, you know, this could make a pretty good reflector for an antenna. Now this kind of folding sieve has I think been around for quite some time. I remember my nana, who actually passed away when I was about 13 years old. She lived in Cardiff in Wales, so I only used to see her a couple of times a year, and I seem to vaguely remember that she had one of these in her kitchen, and at the time I found it quite interesting how it actually works and folds. And when I did see this on the internet, it kind of triggered that memory in my mind. So I think this has been around for quite some time, but it would make a really good folding reflector for various different types of antennas. Then you can close it up, and you can actually protect the element depending on what antenna you're going to make. Now I've already had a go at making a biquad with this reflector, and it does fold up and protects it. I'll show you that in a moment. But I thought for this video what I'll do is I'll make a helical antenna for 5.8 GHz FPV. And again, it will protrude out of the middle there, and the basically the reflector will fold up and around it, so it reduces its footprint, and it's more easily transportable. So this is the single biquad one that I made for 2.4 GHz. Now what I've found with this is the metal that this is actually made of, you can't actually solder directly onto it. The solder does not stick. Now it's not aluminium, but I think it's some kind of alloy, you know, so it won't rust when it's immersed in the water time and time again. But it is magnetic, but you definitely can't solder to it, so I had to come up with a different method to actually attach the coax and the antenna to this to make it useful as a reflector. So I'll show you another method that I've come up with to actually do that. But it does make a really good little antenna, and it folds up, protects that biquad element, and when you want to use it you can just open it up again, and you know, you can actually rivet on an attachment here at the back for a tripod mount. But I just think it's quite a good little novel idea. So what I thought I'd do then is build a helical antenna, like I say, for 5.8 GHz. Now I'm going to do this old school. I'm not going to use a template. I'm going to use a ruler and my eye to actually make the coils. So a little bit different to how I've done it in the past by producing a template. And I thought it'd be a good idea along the way if I told you a little bit about the history of the helical antenna, because it is an interesting story of how it actually came about and the guy that actually invented it as well. Now the measurements that I'm going to be using in this helical antenna are taken directly from my favourite online helical calculator, and I'll put a link in the description so you can have a look at that yourself. And the actual coil former says to actually get some PVC tubing that is 17.7 millimeters in diameter. So this is going to form the coils and also support the coils as well. And this is actually 18 millimeters diameter, so it's close enough. You want to find something around 17 to 18 millimeters diameter. And this plastic tubing, actually I ordered some brass rods recently, and they came inside this PVC tubing here delivered to me. And as soon as I saw this tubing, I just thought, you know, that's a nice size, that I'll save that because I could probably use it again. But if you have a look on eBay or any hardware store, you can find something that's around the same size. 18 millimeters diameter seems to be a pretty standard size for this PVC pipe. Now as for the wire that I'm going to use in this, I'm going to use this copper wire here. Now it's quite thin, it's 21 1 SWG, and the reason I'm using the thinner wire is because it's going to be laid out on the plastic tubing here, supported by the plastic tubing. Then I'm going to cover it with some heat shrink tubing, so it's all wrapped up nicely on here and it's not going to be bent out of shape. If I wasn't going to protect it like this, I would probably use thicker wire. Now, the difference between using thicker wire and thinner wire is thicker wire will increase its broadband properties. So if you made this with, say, 2mm thick copper wire, it would probably work quite well up and beyond 6 GHz and down below 5 GHz, no problem at all. But because I'm making this specific for 5.8 GHz, I'm going to use a thinner wire, and its centre frequency will be bang on that frequency. It will still be a little bit broadband even with the thinner wire, and work, you know, below and above 5.8 GHz. So that's the difference between using thicker wire. It doesn't increase the gain or the power of the antenna, but it does increase its broadband operating frequency. Now, as I said, I'm not going to use a template for this. I'm going to do it old school. I'm measuring the distance between the coils myself with the ruler as I go. So I'm going to get a few coils wrapped around here, and then when I've got about 4 or 5 wraps around there, I'll start measuring with the ruler, because we want to be 11.8mm. The coils need to be separated by. When I'm happy with them, I'll tie them down with a little bit of masking tape and then carry on wrapping some more coils. Now, I want to go for about 16 coils around this helical, which will probably be around 200mm long. So it's going to be quite a long helical, and I'm going to be measuring as I go. So I'm going to start winding the coils in place on the PVC pipe. Now, what I've done here is I've drilled a small hole as close as I can to the edge of the pipe here, and I've just got a small leg of the copper wire through that hole just to anchor it down in that position. And I've done it quite close to the edge because basically I'll be cutting that leg away at the end and then gluing this flat to the reflector, so it wants to be quite close to the edge of the pipe there. So what I'm going to do now is just carefully put some tension on there and just estimate the 11.8mm separation here that we actually need for the coils. And when I've got 4 or 5 turns, I'll stop, tie it down with some tape, get the ruler out and get them more accurately spaced out. And when I have, just tie them down with a little bit of tape and then do another 4 or 5 coils. So now that I've got 4 coils wrapped around here, I've just taped it off here so I can actually measure now. I'm coming with my ruler, starting at the feed point here on the first coil, measuring the spacings to get that 11.8 spacing in between each one of these coils. So on my ruler here, I'm just kind of measuring it just slightly under the 12mm mark, and just manipulating them so they're all nice and evenly spaced out. And when you're happy with these coils here, remember to flip it over and do the same on the opposite side to get them all nice and uniform all the way around. So I've got the coils wound around the PVC pipe now, and I've actually got them spaced out how I like them. I've actually got 14 good turns here, and I'll be cutting it off somewhere down here. But what I'm actually going to do now is drizzle a little bit of super glue at certain points along here, just to hold the coils in place, and I can remove this masking tape then. So I'll drizzle some super glue down this side here, turn it to the other side, and then do the same down this side, and that'll hold it in position well. And then when I actually put the heat shrink tubing over the top, it'll do a good job of holding those coils in place. And of course it'll be much neater than having tape around here, because even with the heat shrink tubing you will actually see the tape through the heat shrink tubing. It just looks a little bit too messy for me. So the helical antenna then was actually invented by a guy called John D. Krause, and he was ended up being a professor, a physics professor at one of the American universities. I can't remember which one now. But he was in a lecture, a biology lecture I believe, when they were discussing the helix of DNA. And after the lecture he actually asked if if you could actually use that kind of model for a RF antenna to get circular polarization. Basically he was told no, it would never work, so he went away and actually built prototypes and looked at it further in the basement of his parents' house, and he spent 2 years building prototypes until he was happy with the design and how it actually worked mathematically. And basically, it was then adopted by long-range communication, radar, lots of different applications like that. And also he pioneered the very early radio telescopes. At his university, himself and one of his graduates built a radio telescope using an array of around 30 helical antennas, and they also built the building from scratch somewhere on the university grounds, and quite away from the main building, and pioneered the first radio telescope. Now the university board there actually found out about what he had done, and rather than praise him for the radio telescope that he built, they brought him in and actually in no uncertain terms they weren't happy with him because he'd actually built a small building without their permission. So what actually happened is another university took on his work and then pioneered the radio telescope which we have today. And that's a lot of that is how actually things work in universities. A lot of actual learning and ideas have become stagnant because a lot of these professors who are really top notch in their subjects don't really go out of their way to look into new ideas. And not all professors, I must admit, and teachers at universities, but one of the big things I found at universities in the UK is most of them seem to actually focus more on writing a book. And it doesn't really matter if it's a very good book. They focus on writing a book because it's a big cash earner for them, because then what they can do is put it on the essential reading list, and essential reading lists for assignments. So you've got to get hold of their book and quote from it. So it's a bit of a money earner for them, and you don't really see them actually taking sabbaticals, which is time off, to actually have a go at building on some ideas that they've come up with, or maybe is out there in the community but nobody's done any work on it. You just all they do nowadays is seem to write a book just because they can put it on their reading list and just because they're guaranteed to sell it that way. And John Krause's book, that's called Antennas, if you find a copy, then pick it up, especially if you find it quite cheap. I have got the second edition of his book, and it's extremely relevant even today. And I think I paid about £20 for it, but I think the book now is in probably its 4th or 5th edition, and although he's passed away now, people have actually built on it, so it's got thicker and thicker as new technologies come and are reinvented, and different ideas, and it's added to the book. But I think the latest edition, you probably wouldn't get much change from about £180, so it really is an expensive book. But if you find a 2nd or 3rd edition book going quite cheap, pick it up, because it is still relevant even today on the basics of helical antennas anyway. So I've cut the coils off there that I don't actually want, so I think I've got about 14 turns on this antenna now. So what I'm going to do is cut the PVC pipe about here, so it leaves me about 5-8 millimeters gap distance between the top coil, so when it's all covered with the heat shrink tubing it'll protect the end of the coil there. But what I'm going to do now is just trim this leg that I did at the start. So I'm going to cut away the inside part. Now get a pair of needle nose pliers and actually pull that out and then twist it back on itself like so, and I can straighten that up, and then that'll be my solder point for this antenna then. I've also got to put the copper shim on there in a moment, but that's a nice little solder point that I can connect to the antenna to now. So finally, to finish the helical antenna off then, prior to me covering it with heat shrink tubing, we need to add a metal shim in order to bring the impedance of the helical down to 50 ohms. Now it's really important because a helical has a high impedance, and everything that you will plug into this, whether it be a transmitter or a receiver, will be working at 50 ohms. Now I have seen people make videos and they will say not to bother doing this, but if you don't do it, the antenna itself will be extremely crippled, and it could possibly also damage your equipment. It just depends how powerful the equipment is that you're going to actually plug into this antenna. So I'm going to make the metal shim to bring that impedance down out of this copper tape. You've seen me use this in previous videos. It's a sticky back copper tape, and I'm going to apply it into this area here, and then come in with a soldering iron and flood solder between the coil and the copper tape, so we've got a nice connection all the way around. And I also need to clean off some of this lacquer that's on the copper wire as well. But you could also use a thin piece of tin, and you could get that from, say, a top of a baked bean can. You can even cut that with scissors as well, and just form it around this area here and solder it on. The shim itself needs to be 30mm long and 9mm high, so I'm cutting out this little wedge shape, measured 30mm along here, and then 9mm up, and then just drew a line from that point down to this point here, and then I'll cut that out with some scissors and apply it to this area here. So that's the metal shim soldered in place now to bring that impedance down to 50 ohms. So I'm going to cover all the helical with this heat shrink tubing. It actually measures 38mm in width, so it fits over the top, and I'll just shrink it down with a heat gun. So the heat shrink tubing is on the helical, and what you want to do is leave yourself about 5mm extra overhang at the end here. So it's still warm, it's still quite warm to touch. So what it'll do, it'll start to crimp around the top of the tubing there, and you get yourself something like this screwdriver, and just stick it in the top there and leave it there to actually cool down, and you'll get a nice finish to the end of the helical there with the heat shrink tubing, and it's just a small finishing touch that'll make this helical actually look like you've purchased it and not actually made it. So I did actually finish the antenna, but because I forgot to turn my mic on, I decided to dismantle it and then re-record the rest of the build. But basically what I've done here, because I can't solder to that reflector, I don't know what kind of metal it's made out of, I've had to modify a bulkhead SMA connector. Now this is the one that I've modified, and basically I cut away the outer metal here of the SMA connector just to bring it flush down with the white dielectric. And then what I did, I got a small drill, made the hole that runs through the centre of the SMA connector a little bit wider, and that enabled me to actually push the connecting pin up a little bit further, so it's about 1mm higher sticking out the dielectric there. And what I can do then is actually solder in there, and the helical antenna, this little pin that I made, will fit nicely into that solder pot, and I can solder it in there and it'll give me a good connection. And because I can't solder to the reflector, what I can do is I've got one of the nuts here on the SMA connector, and I can take a second nut and actually sandwich it together, and that gives me a really good connection to the reflector on this antenna. That's the best way that I've come up with so far to actually connect to this. So that's the SMA connector fitted to the reflector, being held in place by those two nuts. And I got the helical antenna and a little bit of masking tape on here, and I'll just put a little mark where the pin actually made contact, and that's where I drilled the hole, so the helical is in the centre of the reflector. And I also attached a small right angled bracket here with a small nut and bolt through one of the holes, and tapped it out so I can actually fit a small tripod to that. Now, because this helical's not flat to the reflector, I've got that little bit of 5mm gap there, so there's nothing to physically connect the helical, the body of the helical, onto. What I've got here is you get these little legs with this sieve, and you also get another one that goes in here, so you've got a little handle to actually lift this out of the boiling water. So I'm going to attach that where it actually goes under these two recesses here. I'm going to wrap some masking tape around here so it's much wider, flood epoxy in the masking tape to the actual metal stand here, put some epoxy around the edges as well, and then push the helical down onto that, solder it in place, and when the epoxy actually sets, it'll be a nice strong connection to actually hold the helical antenna in place. And of course, in hindsight, you could actually start your helical coil about 5 or 10mm in from the edge of the plastic tubing, and that way you could actually trim it down to get it nice and level, and permanently attach the base here with some epoxy directly to the reflector. You could do that as well, and that's probably what I would do if I were to build this again. So the epoxy is now set, so what I'm actually going to do now to tidy it up around the base here, I've got a small piece of heat shrink tubing the same diameter as I used to form around the coils themselves, and just a small piece just to heat shrink around here, just to tidy it up a little bit at the base. And another quick tip, because I actually want the heat shrink tubing to actually shrink around here and also around this feed point for the helical as well, just to tidy it up, what I'm actually going to do is get a little bit of super glue, put it around the side of there, and then when I put the heat shrink over the top, I'll let the super glue set, and then I'll actually shrink it around there, and it'll stay connected to that point there and actually shrink around that shape. So here is the helical antenna. I've just done a few finishing touches with some heat shrink tubing just to tidy it up a little bit. Now, I don't want to paint the reflector, and the reason why is because these metal plates here actually rub against each other when you open and close this sieve, and no matter what paint you use, it will start to look messy after, you know, less than a week, and it would look like it seriously had a case of leprosy. It would just look a mess. So if you actually get one of these, I wouldn't recommend painting it. Just try to be as neat as possible on your build, so you don't have to hide any kind of mistakes and serious scratches, etc. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and although I built a helical one here in this video, there's quite a few different antenna designs that you could probably use this folding sieve for, and especially like the biquad, because the sieve completely closes and protects the biquad elements. It really does protect it. If you want to throw it in your backpack, you don't have to worry too much about it. So there's quite a few different antennas you could actually use with this folding sieve. So any questions or comments, drop them below, and if you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, and hopefully you'll join me on the next one.